Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome back to day 4 of Aqsa Week Kids. Our story today begins in Mecca. There lived a man named Khalid bin Walid radiallahu anhu. When Khalid was only a year old, he was sent to live in the desert with the Bedouins. This was a custom at the time. You see, the Arabs would send their babies away from the noisy and crowded city to the fresher and quieter desert. It would help them grow healthier and tougher. They would also learn Arabic from the Bedouins, who spoke the purest Arabic. Oh, Khalid loved the desert, and day by day he grew stronger. Khalid returned to his parents in Mecca when he was 6 years old. In Mecca, Khalid's father Walid would teach him to wrestle, and Khalid became so good at wrestling, and in fact became the wrestling champion in Mecca. Khalid also learnt many other skills such as hunting. Khalid grew up to be a strong and courageous man and a great fighter. He was also very intelligent and was well known throughout Mecca. Khalid belonged to a very important tribe. His father Walid, who was very, very wealthy, was one of the most respected chiefs of Mecca. Around this time, there was a man in Mecca calling everyone to worship only Allah and to leave idol worshipping. It was no other than our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The people respected the Meccan leaders, including Khalid's father, Walid. The people would always do what the leader said. Many of the leaders had pride and arrogance. So when the Prophet said everyone was equal, as you can imagine, the leaders were not happy. The leaders were arrogant. They said, why did Allah not choose them to be a prophet? And why did Allah choose Muhammad, who was a mere orphan? Khalid listened to the leaders complaining about the Prophet, but he was not convinced. The Prophet and the Muslims had suffered immensely at the hands of the idol worshippers of Mecca. They were bullied and treated so badly. A few years later, Allah commanded the Muslims to leave Mecca and to migrate to Medina, where they would be safe. This epic migration was known as the Hijrah. After the Hijrah, the Meccans attacked the Muslims and fought them in the Battle of Badr. Khalid didn't participate in the Battle of Badr because he was on a trade journey. However, when he returned, Khalid found out that so many of his relatives had died during the battle, and that his brother Walid, who had the same name as his father, had been captured. He had been captured along with 70 other Meccans and were held as prisoners. The Prophet was very merciful and kind to the prisoners and treated them well, just as Allah had commanded the Muslims to do. Even though they had been persecuted and treated badly, the Muslims still treated the prisoners very well. They fed them and gave them clothes, and even though at times the Muslims had little food, they would still share the food with the prisoners. Some of the prisoners had to buy their freedom. Some who could read and write were asked to teach some of the Muslim children, as in those days a very few people could read and write. Through this, they earned their freedom. Some prisoners were far too poor and were freed on the condition that they wouldn't fight the Muslims again. The prisoners who were from wealthy families had to pay a ransom to be released. Khalid was sent from Mecca to Medina to ask the Prophet for the release of his brother Walid and pay the ransom. The Prophet ﷺ listened to Khalid and released Walid. On the way back to Mecca To Khalid's surprise, Walid stopped and returned to Medina. Walid then became a Muslim. You see, when Walid was a prisoner, he would see the Muslims pray and respect one another. Walid saw the amazing manners and character of the Prophet and the Muslims. He hadn't seen anything like this before. In his heart, he knew Islam was the truth and that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ really was a true prophet of Allah. Khalid then realized that besides his brother, so many of his relatives had also accepted Islam. A year later, Khalid's family and the people of Mecca convinced Khalid to fight against the Muslims in the Battle of Uhud. Khalid prepared and commanded the cavalry unit, which was made up of soldiers and horses, as they marched towards the Battle of Uhud. During the Battle of Uhud, Khalid's attack harmed so many Muslims. Although Khalid had fought against the Muslims, he soon started to regret his actions. Khalid was a very intelligent man and would often think about the message of Islam. He saw how the Muslims were brave and dedicated to Islam. As he learnt more and more, he began getting closer to Islam. After receiving a letter from his brother Walid, reminding him of the beauty and the goodness of Islam, the words from the letter touched his heart, and Allah guided Khalid to Islam. Khalid took the courage and decided to go and meet the Prophet in Medina. He was worried and thought the Prophet might not speak to him or even imprison him because he had attacked the Muslims in the Battle of Uhud. However, Khalid's worries soon disappeared after he met the Prophet. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ smiled and welcomed Khalid. The Prophet reassured Khalid that if he accepted Islam, Allah would forgive all his past sins. Straight away, Khalid accepted Islam. Subhanallah. Under the Prophet's guidance, Khalid became a better person and an expert in battles and a great leader. A year later, Khalid fought in the Battle of Mu'tah against the Romans. Mu'tah is a place between Medina and Jerusalem. The Muslims were outnumbered. It looked like the Muslims were going to lose the battle. But then Khalid took command of the army. Khalid did what he did best. After breaking 9 of his swords and with his skills and bravery, he managed to save the Muslims. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was in Medina at the time. That's over 1,000 kilometers away. But he was informed by Allah what was going on in the battle. The Prophet then announced that the new commander was Khalid bin Walid radiallahu anhu, the sword of Allah, and he saved the Muslims. And this is how Khalid bin Walid became known as the sword of Allah. Khalid became a close and trusted companion of the Prophet. He was always at the forefront of protecting the Muslims. After our beloved Prophet Muhammad ﷺ passed away, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu became the Khalif, the leader of the Muslims. The Romans and the Persians were the two major superpowers at the time. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu sent Khalid radiallahu anhu to fight against the Arab tribes in Iraq, who were joining forces with the Persians against the Muslims. Khalid led his army in many battles in Iraq and was victorious every time. Alhamdulillah. Abu Bakr had now received news from the Muslims who were heading towards Masjid Al-Aqsa that they were in danger. You see, the Romans had sent many armies to fight against them. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu wrote to Khalid, telling him to hurry and join the Muslim forces. Khalid radiallahu anhu had to move quickly. If he went the long way, following the river, it would take him 10 days to get to the Muslims, and this would be too late. So Khalid ordered his soldiers to take a shorter route, but a more dangerous route through the scorching desert. The desert was dry and barren with very little water. No one had attempted this route because it was so dangerous. Because of Khalid's brave decision, they managed to join the Muslim army in half the time, in only 5 days. The Romans had now prepared an army of 200,000 soldiers. The Muslim army only had 25,000. Most people thought the Muslims for sure will be defeated. Khalid worked with the other commanders and planned the battle. This was the Battle of Yarmouk. This was in fact the greatest battle that Khalid is known for. Now remember, the Romans were the strongest empire at the time. They had raised an army from all over the empire with many experienced commanders. The soldiers were trained and well armed, and there were so many of them. The Muslim armies clashed for 5 days. Every day they fought hard, and they were exhausted fighting such a large army. And even though they were exhausted, they showed great bravery and continued to fight without fear. With Khalid's great leadership, the Muslims won. The Roman army had been defeated, and this was a huge victory for the Muslims. After this amazing victory, the Muslim army was so happy. They celebrated all night long with prayers and beautiful recitation of the Holy Quran. Some started saying that Khalid had brought them victory. The Caliph Umar radiallahu anhu got worried that some people were saying that victory was because of Khalid instead of Allah. Allah is the one that gives victory. To protect the Muslims from thinking this, that the victory came from a person, Khalid radiallahu anhu was asked to step down from being a commander. He completely understood why the Caliph had said this and willingly stepped down as a commander. The new commander was a great companion, Abu Ubaidah radiallahu anhu, who continued to take advice from Khalid bin Walid radiallahu anhu. After the defeat of the Romans at Yarmouk, the Muslims continued to free all the other towns and villages that were occupied by the Romans. Just as the Prophet ﷺ had taught, to always go for peace first and show compassion and kindness to the people, the Muslims offered a peace treaty to the people of the towns and the cities. With a peace treaty in place, the people could live freely under the protection of the Muslims. The people knew that the Muslims were honest and would always honour the treaties. Through these treaties, many people appreciated Islam, and some people even chose to become Muslims. Alhamdulillah. After the major battles, the Muslim generals, including Khalid bin Walid radiallahu anhu, travelled to Jerusalem. This was their main goal of fighting the Romans, because they wanted to free Masjid Al-Aqsa. Before long, a huge Muslim army gathered outside the walls of Jerusalem. Khalid, with the rest of the army, asked them to surrender the city and offered them peace. The Roman leader of Jerusalem, Sophronius, said he would only surrender if the Caliph Umar radiallahu anhu personally comes to Jerusalem. So Khalid and the other leaders could either attack or write a letter to Umar radiallahu anhu to come to Jerusalem. If they wrote a letter, it would mean that they would have to wait for at least 4 months because that's how long it would take for the messenger to travel to Medina and for Umar radiallahu anhu to travel to Jerusalem. However, the Muslim army knew that fighting was a last resort, and they had to do whatever they could to get peace first, especially because Jerusalem was so special and sacred to the Muslims. So they all agreed and sent a letter to Umar radiallahu anhu to Medina. When Umar radiallahu anhu received the letter, he did not want to fight in the holy Masjid Al-Aqsa, and he decided that he would travel to Jerusalem. After arriving to Jerusalem, Umar radiallahu anhu wrote a peace treaty. In this treaty, Umar promised peace and protection to everyone in Jerusalem. Umar did not force anyone to become a Muslim. The Christians could keep their churches and keep their houses and keep their land. Nothing would be taken away from them. He also allowed the Jews to live and pray in Jerusalem. Now, if you remember, the Jews had been stopped from visiting or living in Jerusalem by the Romans. This great treaty of Umar became known as Umar's Assurance. After Umar radiallahu anhu had finished writing this great treaty, Khalid radiallahu anhu and a few others signed it. This was to show that all the Muslims respected what Umar radiallahu anhu had offered, and Jerusalem would become a free city. After signing the peace treaty, all the Muslims went to the sacred Masjid Al-Aqsa. When they entered the Masjid Al-Aqsa sanctuary, they were so upset to see that the Romans had been using it as a rubbish tip. Umar, Khalid, and the other Muslims started to clean the entire place. They cleaned the land and made it pure once again, and then they read Salah. Defending the Prophet, protecting the Muslims, and liberating Jerusalem is how our hero, the Sword of Allah, Khalid bin Walid radiallahu anhu, contributed to freeing the sacred Masjid Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. Allah has blessed Masjid Al-Aqsa. One of the most special things about Masjid Al-Aqsa is Al-Isra. The Prophet ﷺ went on a miraculous night journey from the Kaaba in Mecca to Masjid Al-Aqsa and read Salah with every prophet ever sent on earth by Allah. The Prophet then ascended into the heavens from Masjid Al-Aqsa during the Mi'raj and met with Allah. These incredible events happened in Masjid Al-Aqsa. How special is Masjid Al-Aqsa? We should always have a special place in our heart for Masjid Al-Aqsa and make dua that Allah keeps our special Masjid Al-Aqsa safe. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.